Welcome to 7-Minute Torah, an exploration of the weekly Torah portion with me, Rabbi Micah Streifer. If you enjoy this podcast, please feel free to subscribe or comment or share it with a friend. They say that every ending is also a beginning, that when one thing ends, it represents the start of something new. That's actually a deeply Jewish idea. In one of the prayers of the evening prayer book, it says that Golel or mipnei choshech, vechoshech mipnei or. That at the end of every day, God rolls the light into darkness, and then at the end of the night, rolls the darkness into light. There's a certain comfort in knowing that even as one thing, as one day ends, the sun will always rise tomorrow. As we read this week's portion, which is called Vay'chi, we find Jacob at the sunset of his life. Vay'chi Yaakov be'eretz Mitzrayim shvas rei shana. Jacob lived 17 years in the land of Egypt. Last week, the patriarch Jacob came to live in Egypt, following his son Joseph, and the entire family, in fact, came and settled in Egypt. We learn now that 17 years later, Jacob dies. Before he dies, he does two things. He calls for his son Joseph to bring his sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, so that he can see them and bless them. And then Jacob gathers all of his 12 sons and gives them a blessing. This seems to have been a common practice in the ancient world. We see it in the story of Jacob and Esau's father Isaac, who also gave each of his sons a blessing before he died. So Jacob gathers all of his children, and one by one he blesses them. Well, sort of. It's hard to characterize some of these as blessings. It begins with these words: Ha'asfu va'agida lachem et asher yikra etchem ba'acharit hayamim. Gather around, he says, and let me tell you what will happen to you in the future. And Jacob then proceeds with what sound less like blessings and more like predictions for each of his sons, who will ultimately become the 12 tribes of Israel. Some of these are pride-filled and complimentary, like when he says, Judah, your brothers will praise you, or that the tribe of Dan will govern the people, ke'echad shivtei Israel, as one of the tribes of Israel. But others are much less complimentary, like when he declares that Simon and Levi's weapons are tools of lawlessness. Let not my person be included in their counsel. Or Reuben, you are unstable as water, and you shall excel no longer. So you can see why I characterize these as not exactly blessings. From a historical perspective, what we know is happening here is that this text was likely written much later, and it reflects the various geopolitical things that are happening to each of the tribes. Some tribes are in ascendancy, others are declining, some are stronger and others are weaker. And so the assessment of those future tribal groupings is placed back into the mouth of their mythical father Jacob, who seems to predict what would happen at a later time. But from a story perspective, this reads like Jacob's assessment of the character of each of his sons and a prediction of where it will lead them in the future. And we can understand why Jacob would be going through that kind of thought exercise when he's about to die. In this moment of ending, he's thinking about legacy. What kind of life have I led? What kind of children have I raised? He asked himself. What legacy am I leaving, and what impact will it have on the world once I'm gone, since every ending is also a beginning? This parsha represents the end not only of Jacob's life, but also of the book of Genesis. And it's a neat coincidence that it happens this year to coincide with the end of the year and the beginning of the new year. Now, of course, New Year's is not a Jewish holiday. We already celebrated our New Year a few months ago back in September. But we also live in the secular world, and so the end of 2020 and the beginning of 2021 has meaning for us as well. And what is very Jewish is the idea that at moments of transition, we look backwards and ahead, seeking an assessment of where we've been and what we've done, and thinking about where we're headed. 2020 has not been an easy year. I think many, if not most of us, will be happy to say goodbye to it, to welcome the beginning of something new. But the lesson of this parsha is that there's no such thing as just looking forward without also looking back. Looking back at what we've learned, what we've accomplished, what we've gained, what we've lost, at what's changed, both for the worse and for the better. 2020 sometimes feels like the year that wasn't, the lost year. After all, we were cooped up in our houses, we were afraid, a lot of things got put on hold. We were ready for it all to be over. But this is not the year that wasn't. It very much was. And now that it is over, it's worth pausing to contemplate what you've learned, what you've gained, and what you've lost. How this year leaves you different than you were a year ago. One of the great qualities of the figures in Genesis is their resiliency. Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob, Leah and Rachel, Joseph and all his brothers, they haven't always had it easy. Throughout these stories that we've read, they've dealt with war, famine, barrenness, family conflict, geopolitical struggles, and personal struggles, all rolled up into one. And yet, we've watched them move forward, armed with a belief in continuity and family and community. With faith, maybe in God, but also in their own capacity to put one foot in front of the other and to learn from their mistakes. And as we reach the end of the book of Genesis, it's clear that that resiliency is one of the great lessons of the story. That no matter who we are, no matter what life throws at us, we have the capacity to learn, to grow, to overcome, to make the world a better place. So now it's time to end one thing and begin another, because every ending is also a beginning. Joseph and his brothers and that whole generation passes away, and the book of Genesis comes to an end. So the story of our matriarchs and patriarchs, the story of our origins has ended, but the story of our becoming a people, of our quest for holiness, of our belief that the world can be redeemed, can be a better place, that story is just beginning. See you next week. Thanks for listening. Thanks for listening to 7-Minute Torah. If you enjoyed this program, please leave a review or a comment, and please pass it on to a friend. You can also subscribe on iTunes, Spotify, Google Play, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Have a great week.